Now, I had the opportunity to speak with Ariel at the National Association of Hispanic Journalists National Convention in July. I was the moderator for Climate Solutions, How Journalists Equitably Engage Communities panel organized by the Solutions Journalism Network. Ariel was one of the guest speakers, and he shared how your newsroom embraced collaboration and solutions coverage of climate change. Tell us why there was an urgent need to rethink the way you conceptualized and executed those stories.
I think to understand the evolution of climate change reporting at NBC, we have to go back maybe 15 or 20 years to our previous chief meteorologist, John Morales, who was sporadically talking about climate change, but without any support. And quite frankly, he was really brave to do it because it was at a time where you could put your career at risk if you said the wrong thing. Even though we all wanted to talk about it, many people weren't. When I started at NBC6 in Miami in 2017, John Morales and I said, let's just do it. Let's go full all the way climate change. And our bosses at the time said, this is great. But again, we just didn't have the resources. So it was sporadic. It was not consistent. And then Ariel is actually the one that hooked up with the Solutions Journalism Network. And he brought this project to us. And the project was to teach the entire newsroom how to do solutions-based climate change reporting. And he came to me and said, Steve, I want to work with you directly. You'll work on the NBC side with all your people. I'll work on the Telemundo side with all my people. And for a year, we did an entire project with 6 or 7 on-air, either stories or documentaries. I did a half-hour documentary. Ariel did one. And then we also had some shorter stories. And our newsroom has said, this is what we want more of. And it starts at NBC Network all the way down. They want more climate change reporting and not less.
And it's worth mentioning you work in a duopoly, and a duopoly is where you have an NBC newsroom, English dominant, of course, and a Telemundo newsroom, Spanish dominant, of course, and they are both under the NBC Universal umbrella. Ariel also shared insights about a presentation that he produced in collaboration with others, of course, Solutions Journalism for Broadcast. And a lot of times, as a trainer myself, when I'm talking to journalists from different platforms, especially in broadcast, television and radio, and I know you know this, time is very limited, right? We're talking about sometimes the weather forecast, perhaps not in South Florida, where there's a lot of more weather happening than, say, here in Chicago. But on average, the forecast is, if on a good day, 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. And when we're talking about other stories, obviously much shorter. So one of the things that he mentioned in his presentation was in talking about how to produce solutions journalism, long and short form story formats. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. I would actually say that there are 3 types of stories or content related to climate change that a meteorologist can produce. Now, reporters, I would put in a separate category because they're not going to go on TV and talk about the weather. They're going to just do climate change. But for a meteorologist, there are 3 ways we can talk about climate change. Number 1, put it within the content or the context of a weathercast. So it's 105 degrees. How is climate change causing this? How much of a record is this? When was the last time we saw numbers like this? So we can, as meteorologists, always attack climate change simply by connecting it to the numbers and connecting weather and climate. The second way is more of our reporting angles, because Ariel and I are both meteorologists and reporters. The short form is maybe it's a day turn. Maybe it's you go to a producer and say, hey, I saw that there's a wildfire in, California. Can we get some video and let me do a voiceover? Let me do a short story with that. Maybe add a quick zoom to it. Super easy, can be done in one day. And then the third type is the long form. It's almost the way an investigative journalist would approach their work, which is weeks, maybe months of just collecting data and content and then putting it together. In Ariel's case, he created a 30-minute documentary. I did the same. And then I came back this year on January 1st and produced a 90-minute documentary looking back at all the stories we did last year. So the other great thing is a story has more than one life. And when Ariel does his story for Telemundo, we're going to take it for NBC. We're going to repurpose it, turn it into English. We're going to put it on digital. We're going to make it have so much more life than just the one time it was on the air. And that's why those long range stories sometimes get such more eyeballs on them, because they're on digital and people can watch them at their own rate and as many times as they want.
And I think that's really smart because a lot of times what happens is, and not specifically to covering climate, or even talking about the forecast or preparing for a hurricane, as obviously it's a part of living in South Florida. It is that it's a sort of one and done. But when you think about producing, as you've mentioned, Ariel produced a documentary. Now you have something larger that you could slice up and have more content in smaller bites, whether it's for television, certainly social media, and in a digital platform, or vice versa. You could produce if we imagine a pizza pie, you can start with the slices and then you end up with the full pie. So I think that's really smart. Now, you've mentioned, and I've mentioned, you and Ariel are meteorologists, and you are focused on data storytelling. And that's a key part of climate change stories. By transforming raw data into narratives, journalists can provide context to illuminate the science behind climate action and help people understand how the planet is changing. This can lead to more informed engagement and support for policies that benefit environmental sustainability. What insights can you share about how to use data in telling the whole story?
Well, data is truth, and meteorology is truth, and democracy is truth. And when we have access to these numbers, they're not in a vacuum. You can't just throw out numbers to viewers and expect them to connect the dots. So what we do is we make someone understand that number right there, that temperature. Yes, we've broken records before in the past, but that record, we broke this record 1 year ago too. And then we broke it again today. And a year ago, we broke the record that was set 2 years before that. So when you start building this story and you can show people how climate change is doing this, even if we don't see it day to day, that's what my job is. I think also when we talk about the data being truth, I have to live and die by my numbers. That's what I have. I have to believe so much in every number I report. And as a climate change reporter, as long as I'm telling the truth, I feel like I'm doing my job. The hardest part about being a meteorologist and the data and knowing that the data is real is that there are very powerful people who are trying to convince the world that the data is not real. And it's very difficult to not editorialize when you're looking at numbers that you know are true and someone else is saying the numbers aren't true. And it's a very fine line, and it's a very precarious time to be a meteorologist talking about climate change. So we just try to stick to the data and try not to editorialize and hope that people are making the decisions for themselves.
Yes, when I worked at ESPN, we used to have a program called Numbers Never Lie. And you look at the data, and the data is self-evident. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that's one of the things that I most enjoy about working on solutions journalism story is that you're looking at the evidence, and you can really investigate the evidence. You could measure success or the lack thereof, and talk about the other pillars like insights, limitations. And that's so important because too often, what I see in mainstream media and other is there's a lot of coverage about announcements. Here's what an organization plans to do, or a political promises to do, and you can't measure ideas and promises unless, of course, you're looking to see if those same ideas have been tried elsewhere. But when you focus on solutions journalism and you focus on evidence, you inherently are looking at data. And
Mhm.
someone might read, watch, or listen to your story, they might disagree with it, but they can't disagree with the facts. And I think that's very important work that you and others are doing in regards to really painting a clear, accurate picture in regards to what's happening with climate change. Now, finding solutions is of the utmost importance for those who are most affected by climate crisis, the underprivileged, individuals of color, indigenous communities, women, children, and future generations. Despite contributing the least to the pollution causing global warming, these groups often face the worst consequences and lack the financial means to adapt. How can a journalist respect the lived experiences of communities without being exploitative in the coverage of climate?
The answer is sometimes it's impossible because it is what it is, which is you're presenting two people in every solution story. You're producing the people who are affected, and you're producing the people who are part of the solution. Sometimes it's a government entity, sometimes it's someone with a brilliant invention. But unfortunately, if you have to identify the problem first, you do have to highlight people who are being affected. I can just tell you my personal experience. I did an entire documentary on managed retreat, especially happening in the Florida Keys. So basically, long story short, Hurricane Irma comes in, decimates parts of the Keys. Very wealthy people came in, bought up all the property. We call it climate gentrification. But the government is also providing this space for homes to never be built again. So the Florida Keys, they looked at areas where they know are going to be underwater in the next 10 to 30 years. And they said, we're never going to build there again. We're not going to raise the roads there. And we're going to try to make it so no one will ever build there again. So when you talk about climate gentrification, what I have found is that everyone who has ever talked to us on camera that is affected by climate gentrification, they want to go on camera. They want to talk. They want to tell their story because they're not embarrassed. They just have nowhere else to go. And we're the one group of people that can actually tell their story. So I have found that most people are willing to talk. Most people want to tell their story because the place they grew up is they're not going to be able to afford it anymore, or it's going to be underwater and there's no adaptation available because it's too late.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the things that you've mentioned that really resonates, and it's really important when we're talking about solutions journalism. Too often, regular reporting focuses on decision makers, and that's important, right? When we're talking about government officials, different organizations, people with hefty titles, and with those hefty titles also comes a lot of privilege and resources. But not often are people that are affected by some of the decisions of those powerful. And then the people that are most affected by climate change, seldom are they heard and they are seen. So to be able to lend your platform, whether it's television at NBC6, or on a digital platform, and for others on radio, newspaper, that's really important because a lot of the insights that we report on in solutions journalism are coming from the people that are sharing those lived experiences. Now, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, and I wanted to dive in a little bit more about it. The television special, Climate in Crisis. Give us a little more insights about that special, and maybe perhaps some personal anecdotes and how it was received in South Florida.
Well, the first thing to know is that the reason why we can do these specials is because we have a 24-hour digital platform. We actually have there's 1,000 different ways to get to it, but in the end, we post specials on what we call our fast channel. It's basically a 24-hour NBC Miami, taking a lot of content from around the country and then interfusing our local content. Because it's so new, we're just looking to fill time. We have so much space. And for a journalist like me, who is told by most producers when I hand in a story that's 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and they're like, Steve, this is too long. You got to cut it down to 1 minute 45. To have the digital folks say, Steve, this 2 minute, 30-second story is not long enough. We need it to be 10 minutes. What a joy to be told, wait, I can do more, not less, because that is always the hardest part about being a journalist is cutting down. It's almost like a resume. How do you get everything important onto one page? It's impossible. So they gave us 90 minutes. And when I heard that, I was a little concerned that we would not be able to fill it. But here's what happened. On July 1st of last year, maybe it was July 3rd, you might remember it was Earth's hottest year ever since we've been keeping records. And then on the 4th and on the 5th and on the 6th. And it was the 3rd that I went to my boss and I said, I think I got it. I think I understand what the 90-minute special is going to be. We're going to take a look at how 2023 is the turning point. 2023 is that tipping point that everyone warned us about. So let's just take a look at every single climate change thing that happened in 2023. It'll be 90 minutes. And if someone watches it, I don't care what political party they're in. I don't care what their previous views are, where they live. They will watch this and they will come out of it saying, okay, I get it. Climate change is real and we have to fix it. So that was really what we did. And we did a combination of looking back at every climate event of 2023 in Miami and around the world. And then we interfused our solution stories that we had done previously. So all of Ariel's stories from his documentary, my managed retreat stories, all of our journalists, we kind of mixed those in. And in the end, we actually had more than 90 minutes and we had to actually cut it down a little bit. So it was a pretty amazing process. And obviously NBC wants more of that, but these things take a long time to produce. So we tell NBC, yes, we will work on it. Just give us a little bit of time. We'll start working on the next one.
Steve, you've been so generous with your time. My last question is, you clearly have a lot of passion for the work that you do. I'm interested in learning what was it about meteorology that drew you as a not only a scientist but also as a storyteller?
Meteorology itself, I can only tell you that when I was 2 years old, 3 years old, one of my first memories was a giant blizzard up in New Jersey, a big nor'easter. And I remember because my dad couldn't fly home from Europe from a business trip. I, in my mind, decided at that moment I wanted to be a meteorologist. I mean, I look back and I'm like, I know it. That's when it happened. My first memory is of the weather. And here I am, doing the weather. And also, look, I've always been kind of a performer. I love being on stage. I like getting attention. I like performing. I like drawing and creating all the maps. But I also love math. And what better career where you can be both a mathematician and a performer than, being an on-camera television meteorologist. The climate change thing, though, that's new. I mean, I took climate change courses in college and high school. But when I worked at NBC Dallas with Ariel back in the early aughts, we were not allowed to talk about climate change. We just didn't, even though we were watching it happen. And I don't think anyone ever came up to us and said, you're not allowed to talk about it. It was more like, you want to be careful with that. You don't want to anger people. So we were always so reserved. And when I got to end, when there was an opening at NBC Miami, Ariel is the one who called me. He said, Steve, do you want this job? And I'm like, of course I do. And he said, then when you go on your interview, you tell them you want to be a full-time climate change reporter in addition to being a meteorologist, and you'll get the job. And I'm like, are you sure? That sounds awfully risky. He goes, trust me. And sure enough, it's because John Morales wanted this, and he was our chief meteorologist. And the rest is history. So I was able to take the journalism and the meteorology and just put it together, but not on fluff pieces that most meteorologists do, not on human interest stories that, I don't mind doing, but I didn't want that to be my beat. I wanted a beat that actually makes a difference, and climate change is the thing that's going to be around for the rest of our lives, whether we like it or not.
And how wonderful. I mean, John Morales, absolutely a pioneer and has opened doors for many other journalists, and to have that opportunity to focus in on what matters most in regards to climate change, I think is so important. Again, Steve, you've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate this, and I appreciate all the valuable insights that you've shared with all of us.
It's my pleasure. I hope I can help spread the word to journalists all over the world, because what we're doing here in Miami, it's it's challenging at first, but once you get into the groove, I think I think everyone can do it and do it well.
Best of luck as always, and again, I hope to meet you in person one day.
We will. I have no doubt.